For the past half a century, an ancient army of warriors has been quietly conquering the world. Wherever small battalions of China's famous terracotta warriors are exhibited, they win over a new legion of fans.
The Terracotta Army has just become every historian's worst nightmare. Over 700,000 workers were forced into the project.
It's quite extraordinary. Over 8,000 terracotta soldiers have been found there, along with 520 horses, 130 chariots, most of which are still buried.
Many dying in chains and thrown into mass graves. But here is the shocking part. DNA testing was carried out, and it points west.
It becomes clear to the research team that these statues were carved and then buried as an army to protect the emperor in his afterlife.
How could this be possible? The truth behind it is darker than anyone imagined, and what it reveals will leave you shattered.
There's a possibility they really have some other culture stimulation.
That is such an important idea.
700,000 lives buried in clay. The Terracotta Army was the product of fear, obsession, and a ruler who demanded control, even after death. Qin Shi Huang, who declared himself China's first emperor in 221 BCE, had risen from the brutal wars of the Warring States period. He unified rival kingdoms through bloodshed and enforced the harsh political philosophy of legalism, which treated people as resources to be used and discarded. He believed that the enemies he had slaughtered in life would continue to threaten him in death. To prevent this, he ordered the construction of a tomb defended by thousands of life-sized clay warriors who would serve him in the afterlife as faithfully as living soldiers did in his reign. This decision created one of the largest labor campaigns in ancient history. The historian Sima Xi'an, writing more than a century later, recorded that over 700,000 workers were forced to build the mausoleum. In the context of the 3rd century BCE, this was an unimaginable number. Whole towns and villages were emptied of men, and in some regions, the majority of working-age males would have been taken away. These were not paid workers who could refuse the task. They were conscripted by the state, which had the power to seize anyone it needed. The construction lasted more than 36 years, continuing through most of Qin Shi Huang's reign. This meant that people were born into families where fathers had already been drafted to the project, and those sons later grew up to work on the same site. Some men may have known nothing in their adult lives other than laboring on the emperor's tomb. Accounts suggest that many of the workers who knew the secrets of the tomb's design were executed once their work was finished. The idea was that no one alive could reveal the emperor's hidden afterlife chamber. Some scholars have argued that the deaths of these workers may not have been only about secrecy or punishment. There are theories that they were killed deliberately as part of ritual sacrifice. Qin Shi Huang was obsessed with immortality, and he surrounded himself with alchemists and priests who promised magical ways to prolong life. The idea was that their blood and lives would bind the mausoleum spiritually, transforming it from a simple burial site into a sacred fortress meant to guard the emperor forever. This practice would not have been without precedent. Earlier dynasties in China, particularly the Xi'an dynasty, carried out human sacrifices to accompany rulers in death. Servants, guards, and even entire groups of people were killed to be buried with kings so that they would continue serving in the afterlife. Qin Shi Huang may have revived or adapted these ancient rituals, applying them on a scale that matched his vision of absolute rule. Rumors describe men being dragged into underground chambers as part of these sacrifices. They were beaten when they resisted, and once inside, heavy doors were closed behind them. The air grew thin, and they began to choke. Some tried to scratch at the walls until their fingers bled. but nothing helped. They had to face the slow realization that no one was coming back for them. Terror filled their eyes as they collapsed one by one, knowing exactly how they were going to die. Another describes victims being forced to the ground, while attendants poured thick, foul-smelling mixtures of oil and minerals over their bodies. Then torches were thrown at them. The flames consumed them as they screamed for help that never came. The pain was immediate and unbearable. They begged for it to stop, but no one listened. Those who watched believed that the greater the suffering, the more powerful the sacrifice. These heart-wrenching discoveries have forced historians to question whether the workers truly came only from Qin. Over 700 men could not have been pulled from one heartland without destroying its own stability. And so, historians asked, could convicts, slaves, and sacrificial victims have been taken from beyond Qin's borders? These questions drove scientists to investigate further, and what they uncovered was disturbing. Recent DNA studies suggest that some of these workers may have come from much farther away, with findings that pointed west. Yet even before science revealed this, theories were already spreading about where these men might have truly come from. Outsiders, nomads, and the vanished tribes. One of the strongest claims focuses on the nomadic tribes of the northern frontier. These groups, known for their mobility and horse-riding culture, were constant enemies of Qin. Among them were the Xiongnu, feared for their raids and military skill. They attacked border settlements, burnt crops, stole livestock from poor farmers, and took captives. They left behind struggling villages in ashes. Qin armies responded with overwhelming brutality. Historical records describe how entire encampments were wiped out, with men slaughtered. Women and children were taken as prisoners. Some archaeologists believe that when Qin forces captured them, whole families were enslaved and transported south to work on Qin's Terracotta Army. The evidence that fuels this theory comes from skeletal traits found among certain remains near the mausoleum. A few skulls and bone structures show physical characteristics not typical of central Chinese populations at the time. To some researchers, this suggests that defeated tribes were absorbed into the labor camps. Another disturbing theory is that of the so-called ghost tribes. Ancient Chinese texts speak of groups such as the Rong and the Dai, who once lived across large areas on the edges of the early Chinese states. They appear in records as enemies and rivals, but then they vanish without explanation, leaving almost nothing behind. Some historians suggest their disappearance was not natural at all. They believe these people were wiped out through capture and enslavement, their families broken apart and forced into labor until no trace of their culture remained. The mausoleum, with its endless hunger for workers, has been suggested as the place where these lost tribes were swallowed up. The most widespread rumor ties directly to Qin Shi Huang's bloody campaigns of unification. As he conquered rival states one after another, entire populations were ripped from their homes. When a kingdom fell, its soldiers, craftsmen, and even farmers were rounded up like cattle and forced into marches that stretched for days. Some accounts claim that tens of thousands of people were driven to Xi'an to work on the mausoleum. In this reading, the project was also a tool of ethnic cleansing. The emperor may have seen mass deportation as a way to weaken conquered regions, strip them of their manpower, and simultaneously use that manpower to build his own eternal stronghold. If any of these claims hold even a fragment of truth, then the mausoleum was built not only on the backs of Qin's own people, but also on the lives of outsiders whose histories were deliberately erased. All these claims create a chilling backdrop. Yet the first breakthrough came when researchers began extracting DNA from the bones. They found hard evidence that reality was just as shocking as the myths. Digging into the bones. The study began with the recovery of human thigh bones, which are often the best source of preserved DNA because they are large and dense. 50 thigh bones were chosen from skeletons unearthed in graves close to the mausoleum. Ancient DNA is extremely fragile. It breaks down in soil over thousands of years, leaving only fragments inside the bone. Before any analysis could happen, the scientists had to carefully clean the bones to avoid contamination from modern human DNA, since even a single touch could alter results. They then drilled into the bone to extract powder from the dense inner core, which was more likely to still hold genetic material. From these 50 samples, only 19 produced DNA that was usable. The rest had degraded too far. While this was a small number compared to the thousands who must have died there, it was still enough to give an astonishing glimpse into the genetic identity of the workforce. Of the 19 individuals, only 4 were linked to haplogroups that match the Han Chinese, the majority population in China today. Haplogroups are sets of genetic markers passed down through maternal lines, which means they can be used to trace a person's ancestry back to specific regions. The presence of only 4 Han individuals was shocking because it overturned the belief that the mausoleum's workforce was drawn mainly from the Han heartland. 7 of the skeletons carried haplogroups more common in southern China, among subtropical and coastal populations. This meant that men from regions hundreds of miles away had been uprooted and brought north to Xi'an. The difference in environment was extreme. Southern communities lived in warm, humid climates, while the mausoleum stood in a colder, drier zone. This was not a case of neighbors being called to serve. It was evidence of mass relocation across great distances. The most explosive discovery was one skeleton carrying haplogroup M7A. This haplogroup is extremely rare in mainland China and is most often found in Japanese populations. Its presence in a grave at the mausoleum raised urgent questions. Did Qin's reach extend across the sea? Were maritime peoples captured and forced to work on his projects? Or did an individual from Japan or its coastal waters somehow become trapped in the machinery of Qin's state? Whatever the explanation, the discovery proved that the workforce was not limited to a single landmass. And this was only the first shock. Later DNA studies would uncover something even more unsettling, traces that point toward a Western connection. For the scientists, the findings made one fact undeniable. The mausoleum's workforce was diverse, but that diversity came from forced displacement. And here is where the story takes an extremely bitter turn. Erased identities and silenced cultures. When Qin Shi Huang forced hundreds of thousands into his service, he did not only steal their bodies, he stripped them of everything that made them who they were. The tragedy of these men is not only that they labored and died in misery, but that the empire worked deliberately to erase their languages, their traditions, and even their names from memory. They became faceless laborers long before they were buried. The Qin dynasty was obsessed with uniformity. The emperor imposed a single script across the empire and banned the use of regional writing systems. Local customs, songs, and oral traditions were treated as threats. The infamous burning of books and execution of scholars was not simply an act of censorship. It was an act of cultural violence meant to silence every voice that did not praise the emperor's vision of unity. The same mentality extended to the men dragged into the mausoleum works. Whatever songs they sang in their villages, whatever rituals they once practiced for their ancestors, none of it was allowed to survive in the pits of Xi'an. Archaeology bears this out in painful ways. Graves around the site are strikingly bare. Normally, Burials in ancient China carried objects tied to a person's identity, such as ornaments, pottery, or symbols of rank. Here, there is almost nothing. No markers of clan, no tokens of region, no sign that they belonged to families with histories of their own. It was as if their individuality was scrubbed away. For the people of ancient China, burial in ancestral lands was sacred. It was believed that the spirit must be laid to rest in familiar soil, where family could continue to make offerings and keep the bond alive. To die far from home and be buried without ceremony was a horror in itself. The men pulled into the mausoleum project knew they would never see the graves of their ancestors again, never rest beside their kin. For them, death at Xi'an was not only physical destruction, but spiritual exile. Their souls were condemned to wander without peace, forgotten even by their own descendants. Children who grew up inside these forced relocations would have lost the tongue of their parents, stripped of their identity before adulthood. This is what made Qin's power so crushing. The silence left by these erased peoples makes what comes next even more unsettling. If their identities, languages, and traditions were destroyed, then whose influence shaped the art inside the emperor's tomb? Artifacts that shouldn't exist. Before the rise of Qin Shi Huang, Chinese funerary art followed a long and predictable pattern. Tombs often contained small clay figurines only a few inches tall. These figures were not realistic. They were simple symbols meant to stand in for servants, animals, or soldiers in the afterlife. Their purpose was spiritual, not artistic. Nothing in earlier Chinese art prepared scholars for what was uncovered in the emperor's mausoleum. Yet, inside the pits around the tomb stood over 800,000 life-sized warriors. Each one carried detailed armor, hairstyles, and facial expressions that were different from the next. They were not mass-produced in a way that erased individuality. Instead, they looked like real men who had once lived and marched in battle. This leap in scale and realism is one of the great mysteries of world archaeology. How did Chinese art, which for centuries had produced only small and symbolic figures, suddenly produce an army of full-sized human statues? Art historians began to notice details that were deeply unsettling. The soldiers' bodies showed musculature carved in naturalistic proportions. The folds of their robes fell in ways that suggested weight and movement. Their stances were balanced and lifelike, as if they could step forward at any moment. These are traits not normally seen in Chinese art of the 3rd century BC. Instead, they closely resemble the techniques of Hellenistic Greek art, which flourished after the conquests of Alexander the Great. Greek sculptors were known for their focus on realism, human anatomy, and dynamic poses. The similarities were so strong that scholars began to ask whether Western influence had somehow reached the first emperor's court. The mystery did not end with the clay soldiers. Excavations uncovered bronze birds, including ducks and swans, which were cast with startling naturalism. Their feathers and beaks showed attention to lifelike detail that matched Mediterranean artistic traditions far more than anything local to China at the time. Terracotta acrobats were also unearthed, their bodies bent into complex poses that looked strikingly similar to the athletic forms celebrated in Greek gymnasiums. Each of these finds deepened the puzzle. They seemed to point to techniques and ideas that belonged to the Western world. This raised a question that historians still struggle to answer. How could China have skipped centuries of gradual artistic development to arrive at a style so advanced? Artistic evolution normally builds step by step, yet there is no clear line of progress in China that explains the sudden appearance of the Terracotta Army's realism. The leap looks less like an internal development and more like an outside influence was suddenly introduced. Qin Shi Huang's obsession with immortality may explain why he was willing to embrace methods that were foreign to China. If outsiders carried not only strange medicines, but also advanced artistic skills, the emperor would have been eager to use them. Some scholars suggest that Qin may have seen Western artisans as keepers of secret knowledge, men whose techniques could ensure his name would never fade. These artifacts challenge the old idea that China was fully isolated until the Silk Road opened more than a century later. They suggest that the first emperor's court may already have been a crossroads of civilizations, long before history officially records it. These artistic anomalies raised suspicions for years. But suspicions are one thing. What came next was harder to dismiss. When scientists examined the bones buried near the tomb, they made a startling discovery. DNA Points West, the shocking genetic outliers. After the first studies revealed the surprising diversity of the mausoleum's workforce, a smaller group of scientists carried out another round of DNA testing. This work was done quietly, almost in the shadows. They selected cranial fragments and femur bones, the densest parts of the body that are most likely to preserve DNA after thousands of years. The focus was again on mitochondrial DNA, the type passed down from mothers and children, which survives better than other forms of genetic material. What made this study different was the silence that surrounded it. Unlike earlier results, which were cautiously published, these findings were whispered, as though even the act of revealing them was too dangerous. The results unsettled everyone involved. Among the samples were markers that did not point to East Asia at all. Instead, they aligned more closely with Western Eurasia, the region that includes Europe. These were not many, but they were enough to suggest that people with maternal roots outside of Asia were present and buried near the emperor's tomb. If correct, this would place individuals of European ancestry in Xi'an in the 3rd century BCE, more than 1,000 years before the Silk Road is usually said to have connected east and west. The fact that the findings remain so quiet is itself revealing. If they had been unimportant, there would be no reason to suppress them. The silence suggests fear of what it would mean if the Terracotta Army, China's most celebrated symbol of ancient genius, was shown to be tied not only to the emperor's subjects, but to foreigners from the far west. The political cost of such a revelation would be immense. It would weaken the story of the army as a purely Chinese triumph and replace it with a story of global entanglement, forced labor, and silence. The presence of Western DNA also casts a new shadow over the statues themselves. The warriors are praised for their realism, every face different, every feature individual. But what if that realism is not only Chinese? If Europeans were truly there, their features could have been copied into clay, their likenesses immortalized without their consent. This possibility transforms the warriors into something darker. They would not only be defenders of the emperor in the afterlife, but also monuments built upon the stolen identities of foreigners who were never meant to be remembered. This interpretation adds weight to the earlier artistic puzzle. The statues, the bronze birds, the acrobats all showed details that seem to echo Hellenistic Greek art. If Western DNA is present in the workforce, then perhaps those Greek-like features were not an accident. They may have been the result of Westerners themselves, men whose knowledge of sculpture and proportion was stolen by Qin, their skills wrung out of them before they were discarded like the rest. The darkest implication is that this was not just an Asian tragedy. If the results are accurate, the mausoleum becomes one of the earliest sites of global erasure and history's first global crime scene. Men from across Asia, men possibly from the islands of Japan, and now even men from Europe were all consumed in a single ruler's demand to be protected in death. Instead of a monument of unity, the tomb becomes a record of global suffering, where the first connection between East and West was not trade or learning, but exploitation and annihilation. What do you think about this discovery? Comment down below.